In 12 days, the silver market gets the one report that everybody quotes, almost nobody reads all the way through, and nearly everyone misuses. It is the World Silver Survey 2026. And if you care about silver prices, silver demand, the silver deficit, silver supply, or the entire shortage narrative that keeps pulling this market in and out of panic, this is the report that matters more than any headline you are going to hear between now and then. The Silver Institute says it will be released on April 15, 2026, and it is the annual report produced with Metals Focus that lays out the full silver market picture. Mine supply, recycling, industrial demand, physical investment, jewelry, silverware, trade flows, prices, leasing rates, and above-ground stocks. That should immediately tell you why this matters. Because silver is one of those markets where people love dramatic conclusions and hate complete data. They want one sentence. Silver shortage, silver squeeze. Silver is manipulated. Silver is going to $200. Silver demand is collapsing. Silver is just an industrial metal. The problem is, the actual market is more complicated than every one of those slogans, and once the World Silver Survey drops, a lot of those slogans are going to run into numbers. That is why this is the most important silver report of the year. Not because it predicts the exact price next Tuesday, not because it gives you a magical buy signal, but because it tells you whether the core structure underneath the silver market is still tight, whether the silver deficit is still real, and which parts of silver demand are actually carrying this market now. And based on what the Silver Institute already previewed in February, the answer is probably going to make this market even more interesting, not less. Here is what the report is likely to show. First, it is likely to confirm that the silver market is still in a structural deficit. Reuters reported in February that the Silver Institute expects a sixth consecutive annual market deficit in 2026. With the shortfall projected around 67 million ounces, even though total silver supply is expected to rise about 1.5% to 1.05 billion ounces. That matters because it means the silver market is still expected to consume more metal than it comfortably replaces on an annual basis. That is the first thing people need to understand. This report is not likely to show a silver market that has fully healed. It is likely to show a silver market that is still leaning on buffers. And that is a completely different thing. Because when people hear deficit, they imagine empty shelves and instant price spikes. That is not how silver works. A silver deficit means the market is under recurring pressure. It means above-ground stocks, private holdings, recycling, exchange inventories, or investor sales have to help bridge the gap. It means the system can keep functioning, but it is functioning by leaning on cushions. Reuters already made that point back in earlier coverage of the silver deficit story. Undersupply does not always create immediate chaos because the gap can be filled from existing stocks and investor-held metal. That is why the survey matters so much. Because it is the place where the market has to stop speaking in slogans and start speaking in ounces. Second, the report is likely to show that physical investment demand remains one of the most important silver stories in 2026. Reuters reported that physical silver investment is expected to rise 20% this year to about 227 million ounces, which would be the highest in 3 years. That is not a side detail. That is one of the biggest reasons the silver market can stay structurally tight even while other demand categories soften. That should get your attention. Because silver is not being held together by one source of demand, it is being pushed and pulled by multiple demand layers at once. Industrial silver demand still matters. Investment demand matters. Jewelry matters. Silverware matters. Solar matters. Electronics matter. And when the World Silver Survey comes out, one of the biggest things it will do is show which of those layers is carrying more weight now than people think. And here is where things get really interesting. Third, the report is likely to show that industrial demand remains huge, but no longer invincible. Reuters said industrial silver demand in 2026 is forecast to decline around 2% to roughly 650 million ounces, partly because of thrifting and substitution in the photovoltaic sector. That is an important sentence because it cuts both ways. On one hand, industrial demand is still massive. On the other hand, high silver prices are clearly forcing adaptation. That is exactly the kind of nuance people hate. They want industrial demand to either be exploding or collapsing. The truth is usually more annoying than that. The truth is, industrial silver demand can still be historically important, still help sustain a structural silver deficit, and still show signs of efficiency pressure at the same time. That is not a contradiction. That is just what real markets look like. And this is one reason the survey is so important. It tells you whether the silver market is being tightened more by industrial demand, by physical investment, or by some combination of both. Fourth, the report is likely to show that silver supply is improving a little, but not enough to fully solve the problem. The Silver Institute's outlook says total supply should rise modestly in 2026, with mine production up about 1% and recycling up about 7%, pushing recycling above 200 million ounces for the first time since 2012. That sounds helpful. And it is helpful, but it is not the same thing as saying the market is suddenly loose again. Reuters still reported another annual deficit despite those gains. That is the key distinction. More supply does not automatically mean enough supply. And silver is one of those markets where small supply gains can be completely swallowed by the size of the demand machine. So when the World Silver Survey drops, one of the biggest questions to watch is not simply whether mine production rose. The real question is whether it rose enough to meaningfully reduce the silver deficit. Those are very different questions. Now, let me tell you what most people are going to do wrong the second this report comes out. They are going to look for one headline number and turn it into a personality trait. If the deficit is large, silver bulls will scream that the shortage is here. If the deficit narrows, silver bears will say the whole silver shortage story is over. Both reactions are lazy, because the real value of the World Silver Survey is not one number in isolation. It is the relationship between the numbers. How big is the silver deficit? What drove it? Did physical silver investment rise faster than expected? Did industrial demand hold up better than expected? Did recycling respond meaningfully? Did mine supply actually improve enough to matter? Did jewelry and silverware weaken because prices stayed high? Did above-ground stocks keep carrying more weight than people assumed? That is the level where this report becomes dangerous. Because that is the level where the silver market stops being a meme and starts becoming a system. And systems are harder to dismiss. Let me make this practical. Imagine two very different silver reports. In Report A, the deficit is still there. Physical silver investment is strong. Industrial silver demand remains large even after some thrifting. And supply improvement is modest but not game-changing. If that is what the World Silver Survey shows, then the silver shortage narrative does not disappear. It becomes more disciplined. It becomes less about internet slogans and more about a market that continues to consume its margin for error. In Report B, the deficit shrinks dramatically. Industrial demand cools harder than expected. Investment demand underperforms, and supply responds better than forecast. If that happens, then the silver market looks less explosive than people currently think. That is why this report matters so much. It does not just tell you whether silver is bullish. It tells you what kind of bullish or bearish case is actually left standing once the numbers arrive. And right now, based on the Silver Institute's February outlook, the report is more likely to reinforce the idea that silver is still structurally tight than to prove the market is suddenly comfortable. There is another reason this report matters now more than usual. Silver is coming off one of the wildest periods in modern market memory. Reuters reported silver ran above $100 in January 2026, hit a record around 121.6, then violently reversed. That kind of move creates confusion. Some people think the spike proved the silver shortage. Others think the crash disproved it. The World Silver Survey is one of the few documents that can force both sides to slow down and ask the better question. What does the actual silver market balance look like after all that chaos? That is the question. Because the silver price chart alone cannot answer it. Price can be driven by liquidation, panic, rate expectations, ETF flows, retail speculation, and momentum. But the survey is where the physical market starts talking back. And when the physical market talks back, people usually discover they were anchoring to the wrong thing. Some were too focused on price. Some were too focused on narratives. Some were too focused on social media. The World Silver Survey brings it back to ounces, flows, categories, and balances. That is why it is the most important silver report of the year. So what should you watch when it drops? Watch the size of the deficit. Watch whether physical silver investment came in as strong as the Silver Institute's February outlook suggested. Watch how much industrial silver demand held up after all the talk about substitution and thrifting. Watch whether mine supply and recycling actually improved enough to change the structure, or merely improved enough to slow the bleeding. And most importantly, watch whether the report describes a silver market that is stabilizing, or a silver market that is still surviving by leaning on cushions. Because those are not the same market. That is the real thesis here. In 12 days, the silver market gets its annual X-ray. Most people will skim the headline. Serious people will study the bones. Because if the World Silver Survey 2026 confirms another structural silver deficit, strong physical investment, still massive industrial silver demand, and only modest supply relief, then the shortage story did not disappear. It just became more measurable. And in silver, measurable pressure is often far more important than loud opinion.